Hello, and welcome to the second session of Within the Shadow of the Galilean, Sources Within Sources. During our first session, we looked at sources we deemed unreliable. This session will look at sources that are more reliable and the sources within the sources. The first thing we need to understand is that the things that Jesus said and did were not written down. They were talked about, and they were talked about within the faith tradition of different communities. These faith communities did not talk about what Jesus said and did as we would think of as today would be historically reliable. They talked about what Jesus said and did in ways that nurtured their faith. So let's begin by talking about three of those faith communities that we can identify through the pages of the Gospels of the New Testament. After Jesus' death, there was a faith community in Jerusalem that you can read about in the book of the Acts of the Apostles. This was a very influential faith community in the early development of Christianity. And their leaders were Peter and John, the disciples, and the brother of Jesus named James. Their focus was primarily on the Passion Week, the last week of Jesus' life. And it may be that they met every Sunday to celebrate the resurrection in the context of the last week of Jesus' life. I am going to call this Jerusalem group, led by Peter and John and James, the brother of Jesus, the Messiah Resurrection group. I'm going to call them the Messiah Resurrection group because they focused on Jesus as the Messiah within the Jewish tradition. The Jewish word for Christ is Messiah. Therefore, the Messiah Resurrection group. The second group I'd like to talk about is harder to find in the Gospels, but it seems clearly to be there. This is a group of followers of Jesus after his death that was in Galilee. Somewhere in Galilee, there was an unknown leader or unknown leaders who gathered people together to remember the things that Jesus said and the things that Jesus did. I'm going to call this group the Mission and Message group because they focused on the mission and message of Jesus while he was alive traveling through Galilee. The third group I'd like to talk about, I am going to call the Christ Resurrection group. Its founder is the Apostle Paul, who traveled through what is today Turkey and Greece, founding small communities of faith that focused on Jesus' death and resurrection. These three groups all developed shortly after Jesus' death. The Mission and Message group, focusing on what Jesus said and did somewhere in Galilee, may have even started while he was still alive. The Messiah Resurrection group, located in Jerusalem, must have started shortly after Jesus' death as they began to reflect on his death and the significance of the resurrection. The Christ Resurrection group must have started after Paul stopped persecuting the early Christians and before he started his missionary journeys in Turkey and Greece. Paul was interested in the last 24 hours of Jesus' life, but never went back into Jesus' life any farther, nor do the Gospels use anything about Paul in developing their Gospels. So there's nothing from Paul's letters that help us find the Jesus of history. The main takeaway from this group is that every early Christian community was colored by the death and resurrection of Jesus and how they came to understand it. However, the other two groups, the Messiah Resurrection group and the Mission and Message group, have significant understandings for us as the Gospels of the New Testament developed. The Messiah Resurrection group's focus on the passion and death of Jesus probably carried over into the Gospel of Mark and helped with the structuring of the Passion story in the Gospel of Mark. The Passion story is about the last week of Jesus' life and his crucifixion. And the Gospel of Mark has been called a Passion story with a long introduction. So we should not underestimate the influence that the Messiah Resurrection group had on this gospel. It seems the Mission and Message group developed a list of the sayings of Jesus that were in writing and circulated. Matthew and Luke both had written copies of this list and used them in their Gospels. So this group strongly influenced the way that Christianity has understood the teachings of Jesus. These three groups all developed in what I like to call the first generation of the Jesus or Christ movement following Jesus' death. The first generation is made up of people who knew Jesus and people who knew Jesus. There was a strong emphasis on what was said in the groups, but there's not much writing that went on. This generation began after Jesus' death and lasted probably till around 70. Towards the end of this generation, they saw the need to put more things in writing, and so the next generation inherited the few things that the first generation wrote. It is the second generation of the Christ or Jesus movement that has given us the gifts of the Gospels we find in the New Testament today. The Gospel of Mark is the first Gospel in the New Testament that was written. It was written probably sometime after 68 and before 73. At some time, part of that Jerusalem group left and went probably to Antioch, as we hear in a story from Acts. So it is possible that the Gospel of Mark finds its roots in that Jerusalem community, but the one that has moved from Jerusalem to Antioch. There is also a tradition about the Gospel of Mark that it was written in Rome. So it is possible, too, that this community that gifted us with the Gospel of Mark may have made another move from Antioch to Rome, where the final edition of the Gospel of Mark was done. One of the most frequently used words in the Gospel of Mark is immediate. It seems like the author or authors of the Gospel of Mark were moving as fast as they could to tell the passion story of Jesus, although that it is doubtful that the Jesus of history wanted to move as fast as possible to his death. The sayings of Jesus, so beloved by the Mission and Message group, that soon after the Gospels of Matthew and Luke were written, the written document that the Mission and Message group had stopped being copied, and the only reason we know about it is because there are too many sayings of Jesus' teaching in both Matthew and Luke that we know there must have been a written document of Jesus' teachings before they wrote. Another thing we know about the Gospels of Matthew and Luke is that they also had a copy of the Gospel of Mark when they wrote their Gospels. We know that the authors of Matthew and Luke had a copy of the written Gospel of Mark in front of them when they wrote their Gospels, because at points they did not hesitate to copy right from the Gospel of Mark. So, when the unknown authors of Matthew and Luke wrote their Gospels, they had literally a copy of the Gospel of Mark and a copy of the sayings of Jesus that they were able to copy from. Today we call that plagiarism. They did not call it plagiarism in the ancient world, but it is a way that the life and the words and deeds of Jesus have been kept alive. The Gospel of Mark was written sometime during the 80s, and the Gospel of Luke was written around the year 85, give or take 10 years, probably somewhere between 85 and 90. While Matthew and Luke had the Gospel of Mark in front of them and the saying source, they also developed or inherited some of their own stories that are unique to their own Gospels. So, for example, the Gospel of Matthew has a story of Jesus' birth that is unique to the Gospel of Matthew, and the Gospel of Luke has a story of Jesus' birth that is unique to the Gospel of Luke. These three Gospels together, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are known as synoptic Gospels. One of the best ways to study these Gospels is literally to put the stories of these Gospels side by side to see them, so to speak, with one eye. And that is exactly what synoptic means, to see something with one eye. Finally, we want to touch base on the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John is unique from the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke. They seem to have their own way of gathering the material about Jesus' life. The Gospel of John, it seems, developed in the 60s or 70s after the first generation and has a very unique way of talking about Jesus. The Gospel of John is not helpful in understanding the day-to-day life, the teaching, and what Jesus does. It is helpful in a very general way in looking for the Jesus of history, but is only a secondary source for looking for Jesus. Our primary sources as we do a quest for the Jesus of history will be the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the different sources we find within those Gospels. What I like to call the third generation of the Jesus or Christ movement begins with that community of John that seems to have moved away from any touch of the historical Jesus and began to explore who Jesus is in their own context without any context of who Jesus was. This generation was a generation of no one who knew Jesus or knew anyone who knew Jesus. So what are some possible takeaways from our session today? First, it's important for us to remember that things began with people who knew Jesus and people who knew Jesus. And this was vastly stuff talked about within communities of faith. Then in the second generation, there were people who knew Jesus, with people who did not know anyone who knew Jesus. Then finally, by the third generation, no one was around who had known Jesus, and there was no one who knew anybody who knew Jesus. So to quest for the Jesus of history, we go back through the Gospels of the New Testament are written sources to early communities of faith who talked verbally when they gathered together about what Jesus said and did. They did this not through oral history telling, but through oral storytelling. I hope you will join me for our next session, Jesus as Himself.